What happens when a soft-spoken, scholarship student from the south side of Chicago steps onto the elite, tradition-heavy campus of Winston University, only to be mocked, cornered, and targeted by wealthy frat boys who think they own the place? Meet Jalen Carter, who walks in wearing a second-hand blazer his mother pressed the night before, and carries with him not just hope, but years of martial arts mastery and a quiet plan for justice. On his very first day, a smirking student sneers, "Community colleges that way." But what they don't know is Jalen has medals, Ivy League offers, and a calm that's more dangerous than any punch. What follows isn't just about fighting back, it's about flipping the whole system. From hidden recordings to a viral boxing match, a cheating ring takedown, and an unexpected offer of redemption, this story will keep you guessing until the last second. Stick around, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment if this one hits home. Jalen Carter had earned every step that brought him to Winston University. Raised by a single mother in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on Chicago's South Side, he spent his teenage years bouncing between school, a part-time job at the corner store, and a modest dojo tucked between boarded-up buildings. But while other kids sought escape through music or sports, Jalen found purpose in discipline, both academic and martial. So when that full scholarship letter from Winston arrived, it wasn't just a ticket to college. It was proof that all his sweat and sacrifice had meant something. But Winston University wasn't what Jalen expected. Beneath its ivy-covered halls and grand lecture auditoriums, the air was thick with something unspoken, something cold. On his very first morning, walking past the statue of the university's founder, Jalen heard the comment, "Must be lost. Community college is that way." It wasn't whispered. It wasn't even subtle. The voice belonged to Chad Whitmore, son of a board trustee and heir to a family fortune older than most of the town itself. Chad's smirk said it all, Jalen wasn't welcome here. Inside the lecture hall, it only got worse. Eyes scanned his dark skin, his thrift store shoes, his silence. He was the only black student in the room, and though no one said it outright, the looks were louder than words. When Jalen answered a complex physics question the class couldn't solve, Chad muttered, "Affirmative action strikes again," just loud enough for his friends to laugh and for Jalen to hear. But Jalen didn't react. He sat up straighter. This wasn't new. He'd lived through far worse than words. What angered him wasn't the insult, it was the system that allowed it to be normal. At Winston, racism didn't wear white hoods or scream in the streets. It wore pressed collars, smiled during group presentations, and whispered behind closed doors. It masked itself in tradition, like the fraternity Chad led, Beta Kappa Theta, which hadn't admitted a person of color in over 60 years. When Chad and his crew confronted Jalen in the hallway later that day, their message was clear, "You're not one of us. And you never will be." But instead of raising his fists, Jalen raised his phone, secretly recording everything. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about every student of color who had ever been made to feel like a guest in their own country. And that's when the story begins to shift, not with violence, but with quiet resistance. Jalen knew what his mother always told him, "You're not here to fight with fists. You're here to fight with your mind." And now, with every insult and every look, Jalen was building a case, not just against Chad, but against the culture that allowed this kind of racism to thrive behind polished gates. Later that same afternoon, Jalen was headed to the campus library when he noticed a group of students gathered near the science building's side entrance. At the center of the crowd was Chad Whitmore, leaning casually against the brick wall, flanked by his usual entourage. As Jalen tried to pass, Chad stepped in front of him, blocking the path. "Hey, scholarship," Chad said with a smirk. "We've got a little tradition here at Winston. New students have to prove they belong." The word "belong" hung heavy in the air. Jalen knew exactly what Chad meant, and it had nothing to do with academics. He felt his jaw tighten. His body shifted instinctively into balance, muscles coiled, ready. Years of martial arts training had wired him that way. But then his mother's voice echoed in his memory, "You don't prove anything with fists. You prove it by making them regret underestimating you." So instead, he pulled out his phone, the camera already recording, and said calmly, "Just trying to get to the library." "Same as you." Chad didn't flinch. "Same as us." "That's cute," he said. His friends laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was permission to belittle. What Chad didn't see was Jessica Lynn, editor of the student newspaper, watching from the nearby courtyard. She had been investigating Winston's quiet legacy of discrimination, interviewing students of color who had transferred out, reviewing old yearbooks with not a single black or Hispanic student until the late 90s. She saw what was unfolding, pulled out her phone, and hit record. Jalen made his way past them without incident, but the damage was already done. Not to him, but to Chad. Because now Jalen had something more powerful than a fight. He had proof. Inside the library, Jalen found a quiet corner and opened his laptop. Before he could even pull up his physics notes, he heard more laughter, this time from behind a bookshelf. Chad's voice again, loud enough to carry. "Can't wait to see the look on his face when he opens his locker tomorrow." Jalen didn't need to guess what was coming. He'd seen it before: photos, slurs, sabotage. Racism dressed as schoolboy pranks. The next morning, his locker was plastered with printouts of his scholarship award, circled in red marker like it was some kind of scandal. A sticky note read, "Enjoy your free ride." But it was the old yearbook photo tucked into the corner that stopped him cold: Winston University, class of 1963. Not a single student of color. A quiet voice behind him spoke, "They did the same thing to my brother. He transferred after one semester." It was Sarah, a junior who worked in the university archives. Her hands trembled as she handed Jalen a folder filled with photos, letters, and formal complaints, most ignored, some buried. At that moment, Jalen understood, this wasn't just about Chad. It was about a long, ugly tradition of exclusion that hid behind Winston's marble columns and academic prestige. And Jalen, that scholarship kid, had just stepped into a battle far bigger than himself. Jalen didn't sleep much that night. He stayed up in the library, his laptop open, documents spread across the table, Sarah's folder of buried complaints beside his own growing archive of videos, voice recordings, and screenshots. He wasn't just building a case anymore. He was pulling back the curtain on something much deeper, a culture that had quietly pushed people like him out of places like Winston for decades. He started taking notes, not just on physics, but on patterns. Chad and his friends had a routine. They sat in the back row, mocked students during class discussions, and, as Jalen observed more closely, always seemed to ace assignments they barely understood. That's when the pieces started falling into place. During lunch, Jalen watched Chad leaning over the shoulder of a nervous freshman, Miguel Ramirez, a first-generation student from El Paso, mocking his accent and mispronouncing his name. Jalen's fists clenched beneath the table, but again, he didn't react with force. Instead, he opened his notes app and typed every word he overheard. Because he had learned something far more dangerous than any punch: documentation. Later that afternoon, he discovered what Chad's crew was really up to. A shared Google Drive, accidentally left open on a library computer, revealed everything. Uploaded exams. Ghostwritten essays. A network of paid tutors doing the work of rich students too lazy or too entitled to bother. Names, amounts, email threads. It was all there. And guess who was at the center of it? Beta Kappa Theta. Jalen began to realize that this wasn't just about exclusion or mockery. It was a system of academic privilege built on cheating and protected by silence. Wealthy students, often white, were buying grades, and no one questioned them. But when someone like Jalen aced a test or answered a difficult question, whispers of affirmative action followed him down the hall. That evening, as he quietly walked to the dorms, Chad's right-hand man, Brad, stepped out of the shadows. "You should just leave," Brad said. "You're stirring up trouble. People don't like that here." But Jalen smiled, not arrogantly, but with the calm of someone who knows he's already 3 steps ahead. "Thanks for the advice," he said. "But I think I'll stick around. Things are about to get real interesting." By the time Jalen reached his room, he'd already emailed himself backups of everything. He created a timeline, connected incidents to dates, to names, to people who had power and used it to protect their own. The racism he was facing wasn't just casual, it was structural. And the only way to fight a system like that was to expose it, piece by piece. He thought of his mother again, and the late nights she worked double shifts, the quiet pride in her voice when he got his scholarship. He wasn't going to let Chad, or anyone, erase everything he'd worked for. Because this wasn't just about belonging anymore. It was about justice. The next morning, Winston's campus gym buzzed with early activity. Students lifted weights, jogged on treadmills, and practiced routines in the boxing ring tucked in the corner. Jalen was there, as always, alone, focused, in rhythm. For him, this daily workout wasn't about showing off. It was about clarity, control, and staying grounded. He'd done it every morning since he was 12. But that day wouldn't be like the others. Chad Whitmore and his crew swaggered in around 8:15 a.m., loud and confident, cutting through the gym like they owned it. Chad wore his usual designer hoodie and gym gloves, flanked by Brad and two other fraternity brothers. They spotted Jalen mid-set and pounced on the opportunity. Well, look who's trying to fit in," Chad sneered, loud enough for the room to hear. "Hoping those dumbbells will earn you a seat at the table." The gym grew quiet. Students slowed their workouts. Some looked away. Others watched closely. These weren't just words, they were signals. And everyone knew it. Chad walked over to the boxing ring and pointed. "How about a little friendly competition, Carter? 1 round. You win, maybe you earn some respect. You lose, well, losers know where they belong." There it was again, that coded language. Respect wasn't something Jalen was supposed to have. Not at Winston. Not with his skin color, his upbringing, his scholarship. Everything about this moment screamed racial performance, a test, a humiliation trap, framed as sport. Jalen could have walked away. He knew it. But he also knew this wouldn't stop. Chad needed to be confronted, not with anger, but with precision. With truth. He stepped into the ring, calm as still water. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Chad just grinned, bouncing on his toes. "You're gonna wish you stayed in Chicago." The bell wasn't official. Someone slapped the ropes, and that was enough. Chad charged forward with the cockiness of someone used to being untouchable. He threw a clean right hook, fast and strong. But Jalen wasn't there. He'd already shifted left. With one fluid movement, he used Chad's momentum against him, sweeping his leg and letting gravity take care of the rest. Chad hit the mat with a thud that echoed off the walls. Gasps filled the gym. Phones came out. Miguel, the freshman Chad had mocked earlier, was already live-streaming. Jessica from the student paper captured the entire moment. But Jalen didn't gloat. He didn't raise his fists. He simply stepped back, extended a hand to help Chad up, and said, "You should have known, I don't fight your way." It wasn't just about the fight. It was about the message. In front of dozens of students, Chad's illusion of superiority had shattered. And for the first time, Jalen didn't have to say a word to be heard. The story wasn't about who was stronger. It was about who belonged, and who decided what belonging really meant. By the time Jalen left the gym, the video of Chad hitting the mat had already started making rounds on campus group chats and social media. But Jalen knew better than to celebrate. In places like Winston, privilege didn't just vanish when someone got embarrassed, it regrouped, retaliated, and dug in deeper. The next day, Professor Aldrich from Advanced Physics made a surprise announcement. The midterm project would be done in pairs. Jalen's name was called, and then, like a punch to the gut, Chad Whitmore's name followed. Gasps rippled across the lecture hall. Remember, Aldrich said, looking pointedly over his glasses, this project is worth 40% of your final grade. After class, Chad cornered Jalen in the computer lab. His tone was low and sharp. You might have made me look stupid in front of a bunch of nobodies, but let's be real. One call from my father to the dean and you're out of here. Jalen didn't flinch. Instead, he opened his laptop, calmly clicking through folders. That's interesting, he replied, because I've got some calls to make too. Chad squinted. What are you talking about? Jalen turned the screen. Folder after folder, screenshots of the cheating ring, timestamps, email threads, names, including Chad's. You're not the only one who knows how the system works, Jalen said, voice steady. The difference is, I had to learn how to survive it. You just learned how to manipulate it. In a flash of panic, Chad lunged, reaching for Jalen's laptop. But security cameras in the lab caught everything. And so did Amy, a quiet lab assistant who had been watching the exchange from the corner of the room. She stood up, voice firm. I've got it all on camera, she said, pointing to the security feed above. Chad froze. His mask of arrogance cracked for the first time. Later that night, Jalen found his name trending under the hashtag Winston Cheaters, not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because someone had leaked part of the video from the gym and snippets of the cheating ring evidence. The narrative was shifting fast. The next morning, Jalen entered the cafeteria to find a new wave of whispers. Chad and his crew were huddled over their phones, faces pale. Someone had created a fake social media account spreading lies about Jalen, claiming he cheated to get into Winston. It was a desperate move. Jalen walked straight up to their table, calm and direct. Interesting timing, he said, sliding into the seat across from Chad. Especially since I just sent Professor Aldrich everything, including your little group chat where you arranged test swaps. Chad's jaw tightened. You're bluffing. Jessica from the student paper, sitting at the next table, stood up. He's not, she said, holding up her recorder. And I've got interviews with 10 students you scammed. And then, the final blow, Miguel, once targeted by Chad, played a video on his phone, Chad bragging about how they'd been running their little academic hustle for years. The cafeteria went silent. The walls of privilege weren't just cracking anymore. They were beginning to fall. That afternoon, the confrontation everyone had been waiting for finally happened, in the parking lot behind the administration building. Jalen was walking to his car when he saw Chad leaning against a black Range Rover, alone this time. No Brad. No backup. Just a rich kid whose world was unraveling. You think you've won? Chad snarled, pushing off the car. His designer shoes scuffed against the pavement as he stepped forward. You humiliated me. My father's name is on one of the buildings here. You don't get to rewrite the rules. Jalen didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed Chad the trending hashtag Winston Cheaters. The posts were everywhere, on Twitter, Instagram, even picked up by a local news blog. Screenshots of the cheating ring, video clips of Chad's comments, and student testimonials were flooding the internet. Chad's face went pale. My father will, he began, but Jalen cut him off. Write another check. Call another dean. Maybe that worked before, but not anymore, Jalen said quietly. This place is watching now. The world is watching. In a last, desperate act of defiance, Chad lunged at him, throwing a clumsy punch. But Jalen, trained for years in self-defense, didn't even need to retaliate. He simply sidestepped, letting Chad's own momentum carry him into a puddle beside the curb. It wasn't violent. It wasn't flashy. But it was poetic. As Chad sat in the wet gravel, stunned, Jalen said nothing. He didn't have to. That's when Sarah from the archive stepped forward, holding her phone up. She had been recording the entire exchange. Funny you should mention your father's name on that building, she said. I've been digging into those donations. Wait until people find out where that money really came from. Chad looked up at her, stunned. But Jalen didn't gloat. He extended a hand, not as an insult, but as a choice. You've got two options, Chad, he said. Keep digging yourself deeper, or start over. Do better. Be better. For a moment, it looked like Chad might refuse. But then, something in him cracked. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was exhaustion. Either way, he took Jalen's hand and stood up. That gesture didn't erase the harm he'd done, but it was the first moment of accountability. Over the next few days, Winston began to change. The university announced a formal investigation into Beta Kappa Theta. Several students from the cheating network came forward, providing even more evidence. The fraternity's activities were suspended indefinitely. But the real transformation wasn't in the headlines, it was in the atmosphere. Miguel no longer sat alone at lunch. Sarah was organizing a student committee on diversity and inclusion. Amy from the lab signed up to tutor underrepresented STEM students. Students who had once been silent started speaking up. And Jalen? He didn't become a hero. He just kept doing what he came to Winston to do, study, grow, and quietly help others do the same. The battle wasn't over. But the balance had shifted. And this time, justice wasn't just a word on paper. It was visible. It was real. Weeks passed, and the energy on campus felt noticeably different. Conversations in classrooms were more respectful. Study groups became more diverse. Students who had once kept their heads down were now raising their hands, confident, included, seen. But perhaps the most surprising change came from Chad. He didn't transfer. He didn't disappear. Instead, he started showing up, quietly, humbly, to group projects and study sessions. At first, people assumed it was for damage control. But then something shifted. He stopped cutting corners. Stopped sneering. And one afternoon, in the back row of advanced physics, Jalen noticed something remarkable. Chad was actually helping a classmate solve an equation. Not out of pride. Not for show. But because, for the first time, he was trying. One day after class, Professor Aldridge pulled Jalen aside. You could have handled things very differently, she said. Most students would have fought back, maybe even dropped out. Jalen just smiled. My mom always told me, he said, the best fighters know when not to throw a punch. In that moment, Aldridge nodded, not as a professor to a student, but as one human being to another. With respect. Later that week, while Jalen was reading in the library, a nervous freshman approached him. She was holding a stack of books and a notepad. Is it true? She asked softly. Everything they say. About what you did. About how you changed things. Jalen glanced around the room. He saw Miguel leading a Spanish tutoring session at a nearby table. Sarah was organizing notes for the university's new Inclusion Policy Review Board. Amy had just joined the university's STEM mentorship program. And Chad, yes, Chad, was helping a sophomore girl debug her coding assignment. Jalen smiled. I didn't change anything, he said. We did. Sometimes people just need to see it's possible. He looked down at his phone, one new message from his mom, proud of you, baby. You fought smart, not hard. And that was the heart of the story all along. This wasn't just a tale about one student facing racism. It was about the quiet revolution that follows when someone chooses courage over revenge, truth over violence, and dignity over defeat. Jalen didn't just challenge a broken culture, he revealed its cracks, gave others the courage to speak, and helped build something stronger in its place. So, if this story moved you, don't just scroll by. Hit that like button, leave a comment, maybe share a moment where you stood up for what's right. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Because real change always starts with one person. One smart move at a time. The story of Jalen Carter teaches us something far deeper than just standing up to a bully. It shows us the power of restraint, strategy, and quiet courage in the face of systemic injustice. In a world where shouting often drowns out wisdom, Jalen reminds us that sometimes the most powerful response isn't a punch, it's proof, patience, and purpose. Whether you've faced discrimination, been underestimated, or just felt out of place, remember, your presence, your voice, and your integrity matter. Change doesn't always start with a roar. Sometimes, it begins with one person daring to do what's right, calmly, clearly, and with conviction. If this story moved you or reminded you of something you've lived through, I'd truly love to hear from you. Leave a comment below, like the video if it struck a chord, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak truth and heart. We're building something meaningful here, together.